Welcome to today's webinar on the science of the burn. My name is Jill Bryan and I am PEHP's registered dietitian. I also have an educational background in exercise physiology. So today the webinar that I'll be presenting is going to focus on the different types of energy you use during exercise and how knowing this information can help you get the most out of your workouts, which can ultimately help you improve your health and overall fitness. As we start this discussion, I thought it would be first important to understand the different types of fuel that are available to the body. So your ability to go for a run in the morning or to go and ride your bike, maybe you like to swim or go hiking, relies on your body's ability to be able to take the food that you've consumed and convert that into a source of energy so your body can do the different types of activities that you enjoy. The only sources of energy available to your body come from carbohydrates, proteins, and fats in your diet. So when you select what you're going to eat each day, you're ultimately selecting how you're going to fuel your body. Energy for the body does not come directly from the vitamins and minerals that we find in our food or from water. And the energy that our body produces from these different food sources is going to provide energy both at rest and during exercise. When we look at carbohydrates, fat, and protein as fuel for the body primarily relies on only carbohydrates and our fats. The body likes to conserve the protein we consume to help build and maintain and repair our body tissues. Under normal circumstances, protein actually only supplies about 5% of our body's energy needs, and I'll cover this a little bit later in the presentation. Carbohydrates are the main fuel source for energy for our body. That's why when we look at the amount of carbohydrates we should have in our diet, usually it's going to be a much higher percentage compared to proteins and fats. There are some cells in our body, like those in our brain, our nervous system, and our red blood cells that rely exclusively on carbohydrates and glucose for energy. When we look specifically at our muscles rely on a dependable supply of carbohydrates to fuel our physical activity. So every time you eat carbohydrates in your diet, for every 1 gram you consume, those carbohydrates can be converted into about 4 calories worth of energy. I wanted to spend a few minutes and go through the different types of carbohydrates, so when you're looking at how to fuel your body for exercise, you'll know the different types that are available, and then depending on what type of exercise you're doing, you'll know which carbohydrates are better to select. So there are 3 main types of carbohydrates. 2 of them are going to fall under the category of simple carbohydrates, and 1 is considered a complex carbohydrate. So the most simple form of carbohydrates that can be found, they're called simple sugars. They are referred to as monosaccharides. So monosaccharides, as the name depicts, is just 1 sugar unit. There are actually 3 of these monosaccharides that we find in our food source that we eat each day. So the first one is glucose, and glucose is the major sugar that we find in our body. So when we hear the term blood sugar, we're referring to glucose. And glucose is ultimately the type of energy we want to be able to fuel activity for our body. So regardless of what type of carbohydrates you actually consume, once they're absorbed and digested in the body, all of them will ultimately be converted into glucose, so that can be turned into energy for the body. It's interesting, even though glucose is the major sugar in the body, we actually don't find glucose alone in food very often. Usually it's linked to another type of sugar, which is where it comes from. Another type of monosaccharide is fructose. So fructose is naturally found in fruit. It's what makes our fruit sweet. Honey is also another source of fructose. And then the last monosaccharide is called galactose. Most of the galactose in our diet actually comes from milk, sugar, and yogurt when we break down the sugar lactose, which many of you have heard of before. So those are our three main types of simple sugars or monosaccharides. The next type of simple carbohydrates, these are called disaccharides, and these are just simply taking two of the previous monosaccharides that I described and linking them together. So there are three major disaccharides that are found in the foods you can consume. So the first one is sucrose. So sucrose is made by combining glucose and fructose together. So usually you're going to find sucrose in like white table sugar if you're baking with that. It's found in honey, in maple syrup. So we typically tend to have a lot of sucrose in our diet depending on if you're eating a lot of sweets. Maltose is another type of disaccharide that's formed when we combine 2 units of glucose together. So maltose isn't found super often in our foods. We do find it most commonly when we actually break down starch. It's going to be a byproduct of that. But it's also found in the process of yeast fermentation when alcohol is made in that industry. The last type of disaccharide is lactose. So lactose is made when we combine glucose and galactose together. So as I mentioned, lactose is the sugar found in milk, yogurt, and cheese. So when we look at the next type is considered our complex carbohydrates. So complex carbohydrates simply mean we have at least 3 of those monosaccharides together. It can be hundreds or even thousands of them linked together. And the monosaccharide that's linked together to form complex carbohydrates is glucose. So basically a complex carbohydrate, when you're getting that in your diet, simply means you're getting a lot of glucose units hooked together. There are 2 main types of complex carbohydrates that come from plants. So the first type is our starches, and starches are found in some of our starchy vegetables like corn and potatoes. We also find a lot of starch in grains and beans. And starch is a great immediate energy for the body. If we don't use all of the energy from starch, then we do store that in our body to be used later on as a fuel source. The other plant type of polysaccharide is fiber. And fiber is different than starch in that our body actually can't digest fiber, so it's not available for a source of energy for the body. So those are the major types of carbohydrates that you can get for your diet. So as we go through some of the different fuel systems in the body, you can see when it's important to consume these different types of carbohydrates so that you're getting the best fuel for your body for the different types of exercise that you're doing. If you're ever wondering, well, what type of carbohydrates am I actually getting in my diet, it's really easy to identify those from a food label. So if you look at this food label here for the Fiber One cereal, if you go under total carbohydrates, you'll see you're getting 25 grams of total carbohydrates if you have a half a cup of this cereal. But if you look under that, you can see the total carbohydrates are broken down further into the different categories. So if you first wanted to see, okay, how much simple carbohydrates am I getting, you would look under that label and look for the term sugars. So sugars denote simple carbohydrates. You can see in this cereal that there are 0 grams of simple sugars. So immediately under that you can see other carbohydrates. Other carbohydrates indicate how much starch or complex carbohydrates you're getting, and then you can also see there's a dietary fiber, which is another type of our complex carbohydrates. But this really helps. It's a quick way to look at this. By law, the manufacturers are not required to list other carbohydrates, but it's pretty easy to figure out if you add up the other carbohydrates that are listed to see what you're getting. So it's an easy way to add additional or make sure you're getting enough starch or complex carbohydrates in your diet by looking directly at a food label. When we consume more calories from carbohydrates than our bodies can immediately use, our body has a way to store that fuel for later use, like I mentioned. So when we store glucose in our body to be used at a later time, the molecule is called glycogen. And glycogen, if you look at the image here on the right, is basically just either hundreds or thousands of units of glucose linked together. This is needed by the body. We need to have a way to maintain our blood sugar and also to supply energy for muscle use when we're not eating. So anytime you go a few hours without eating, when you sleep at night and you're in a fasting state, this is where our body is drawing energy from to keep our activities going in the body. So the two major places we're going to store glycogen, one is going to be in the cells in our muscles, and the other place is in our liver. So in both of these areas, glycogen is broken back down into individual units of glucose, which then can be converted to the energy source that we need to do the various activities. So if we store glycogen in our muscles, that energy stays specifically in the muscles to be used. If it's stored in the liver releases it into the bloodstream to help maintain our blood sugar levels, and then the muscles can draw on that as well if needed to supply energy for our various activities. So I'll be talking about glycogen all throughout the rest of the presentation, so I just want to make sure you have a good understanding of what it is. So again, it's just a large molecule made up of lots and lots of units of glucose. I mentioned this previously, but I want to make sure you understand this, that when you consume carbohydrates in your diet, regardless of where the carbohydrate is coming from, so it doesn't matter if it's a carbohydrate from milk, from rice, potatoes, beans, once your body digests and absorbs that, it goes to your liver, and your liver will convert whatever type of sugar it was into glucose. That's important so that glucose can then be stored as glycogen as needed. We can't use those other types of sugars to be stored as glycogen. So when we look at glycogen and exercise, it's important to know that our body is constantly using and replenishing the glycogen store that we have in our liver and in our muscles throughout our body. So depending on the type of carbohydrate that you do have in your diet, that's going to depend on how much glycogen your body is able to store. The body has a limited amount of storage available for glycogen both in your muscles and in your liver. So when you look at how much your body is able to store, for most people on average, you store enough glycogen to be able to fuel activity for about 90 to 120 minutes, depending on how vigorous the activity is. So it's important to know that if you're going to be exercising longer than this time period, that you either need to be able to reduce the intensity of your activity, or that you need to plan ahead and know how to consume carbohydrate sources during your activity so you don't run out of energy. I thought I'd bring this up since low carbohydrate diets are pretty popular right now. I know a lot of people are trying out the keto diet, which is a diet that is really high in fat, limits the amount of carbohydrates that you're doing. But when we look at storing glycogen in the body for exercise, research for years and years has shown that the best way to have high glycogen stores is through a diet that supplies a high amount of carbohydrates. So a high amount of carbohydrates would be at least 50% of your total calories every day coming from carbohydrates. So this really enhances, maximizes the amount of glycogen that you're going to store. If you're following a lower carb diet like the keto diet or an Atkins diet, the research suggests, and kind of people's experience, is that it doesn't allow your body to store glycogen as efficiently, and you're going to typically run out of glycogen a little bit faster. But they are doing a lot of research right now in this area to see if trained athletes, if they're able to convert fat or store fat differently, or protein to be able to help with his glycogen stores as well. But currently the research is that if you're trying to store glycogen, you should be consuming a higher carbohydrate diet. So the next type of fuel, so I went through carbohydrates, so the next major macronutrient that our body can use for fuel is going to come from fat. And fat is actually the body's most concentrated energy source. It actually provides more than twice as much energy as either carbohydrates or fat. So if you remember with carbohydrates, for every 1 gram you consumed, your body can convert that into 4 calories worth of energy. You can see here with fat, you actually get 9 calories per every gram. So that's more than twice that of carbohydrates. When we are using up our carbohydrates and we need to start using another fuel source, or when we're exercising at lower intensities, our body can start using stored fat and breaking that down to make that available for energy. So the fat is broken down, it's transported through our body, and then can be taken up by our muscle tissue to be converted into energy. So fat is actually a great way to fuel the body. To help you understand the different types of fats, I just wanted to go through this quickly so you have a basic understanding of the 3 main different types of fat that are found in the body. So the first 2 are called phospholipids and sterols, and neither of these can actually be used as an energy source by the body. They have very different functions. Phospholipids are actually found in our cell membranes. If you look at the image here, they're the little blue images with the little squiggly lines coming off of them. They actually create the barrier for our cell membrane. Sterols, one example that most of us are familiar with is cholesterol. So cholesterol is not used for fuel, but it's used to help create different hormones in the body, and it's actually part of the cell membrane as well to help provide a little bit of stability. So these 2 are not used for fuel, but other functions in the body. The type of fat that we use for fuel are triglycerides that are actually broken down into fatty acids. So when you consume fat in your diet, when you look at a food label and you see fat is listed, usually that's referring to a triglyceride. So it's in the food we eat, and then once it's absorbed into the body, it's actually reformed into a triglyceride, and then we store triglycerides in our fat cells and some in our muscle cells as well. Triglycerides, when they're needed for fuel, they're broken down into individual fatty acids that can then be converted into a fuel source. So when I say fatty acids, that is usually what you're familiar with when you hear different types of fats. So there are a few different types of fatty acids. So one is a saturated fat. This is typically referred to as the unhealthy fat. You're going to find that in butter and cheese, usually the type of fatty acid you want to limit in your diet. The other 2 major types are monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids, and these are the healthier types. Usually you find these in olive and canola oil and in avocados. So under certain exercise conditions, these fatty acids are going to be used as a major source of fuel for the body. So I just wanted you to be aware of the different types of fats, where they come from, and which ones are actually used as a source of fuel. So the last fuel available for the body comes from proteins. So proteins provide the same amount of calories as energy as carbohydrates do, so you get 4 calories for every gram you consume. Proteins, the building block for proteins are called amino acids, and there are approximately 20 different types of amino acids that are used to build all the different proteins used by the body. Many of us are aware protein is found in a wide variety of food. It comes from all of our animal protein, animal sources. So if you eat beef or poultry, if you have milk or cheese, all of that's going to contain protein. We also get protein from our beans, eggs, and nuts. So while protein can be used as a fuel source, I mentioned this earlier, very little protein is actually used. So I mentioned earlier, only 5% of the energy that our body generates comes from protein. So protein has many, many different functions in the body, and we want to reserve protein for those uses instead of energy. So now we've gone through our carbohydrates, our fats, and our protein. So now we want to know, how do we take the food that we're eating and convert that into usable energy by the body so we can do the work that we want to do the different types of exercises that we want to do. So I'm going to review the different fuel systems of the body, and I'm going to try and keep this very basic so it doesn't sound like we're in a chemistry class. But it's really important and useful to understand these different body systems so that you know when you're working out, you know what type of fuel you're using, so ultimately you know how to fuel your body best. So as we start to talk about this, the first thing I need to explain is the type of energy that comes from food. So anytime you eat anything, ultimately what you're trying to do is convert that food into an energy source that is used by the body. And the body actually only uses this one specific type of molecule for energy, and it's called adenosine triphosphate. So the abbreviation is ATP, and that is what I will refer to this as for the rest of the presentation. So regardless of if it's carbohydrates, fats, or protein that are going to be used as energy, all of them will follow a different path in the body to be ultimately digested into this chemical energy form of ATP. So when you think of ATP, I want you to kind of think of it, this is the immediate energy that your body, and specifically your muscles, are going to use when they contract to do a movement. So ATP is going to be similar to a battery. So if you think of a battery, the purpose of a battery is to store energy when it's needed immediately. That's exactly what ATP does. So as soon as you start to do any movement, let's say you're going to tie your shoes, you're going to go for a walk, or even if you're going to go and ride your bike for a long period of time, your body needs ATP to do any of those types of movements. The problem with ATP is that we only store a very, very small amount in our muscle cells. So we only have enough to do about 2 to 4 seconds worth of energy. So that initial response when you need to do something draws on that energy stored from ATP, excuse me, and allows you to do whatever the movement is very quickly. So because we only have about 2 to 4 seconds worth of that energy stored, the body needs to have other systems in place that can immediately begin to regenerate and create this ATP energy so we can continue doing movements that we want to. Otherwise, we'd be very limited and we wouldn't be able to do very many activities for a very long period of time. So this is just a diagram of what ATP looks like. It's a unit of adenosine with 3 phosphate groups attached to it. So the way we actually get energy is we break the bond between one of the phosphate groups and the adenosine, and this bond holds the energy. So as soon as that bond is broken, the energy is released for the body to use. So it's a very simplistic idea, visual here, but I wanted you to see that's actually where the energy comes from for our body to use. So there are 3 major energy systems that are used to supply this continual energy for the body. So the 3 systems I'm going to go through, one is immediate energy that starts working, regenerating ATP as soon as movement begins, and this is the phosphocreatine system. The next short-term energy system is going to be, it's called the lactic acid or anaerobic system. And then when you're doing activities that are longer in term, which means longer than 2 minutes up to several hours, you're going to be using an energy system called the aerobic system. So I'll go through these quickly, keep the ideas very simple. So the first one for immediate energy production, like I mentioned, is the phosphocreatine system. So this is a way for our body to immediately resupply the energy that is needed through ATP. So phosphocreatine is stored in very small amounts within our muscle cells. If you look at this image on the page, it shows you exactly how phosphate creatine regenerates ATP. So simply taking creatine and phosphate, you're going to separate those out. By doing that, that free phosphate can combine back with the ADP and create a new unit of ATP. So it's just a quick source of phosphate to regenerate ATP. But just like ATP that we store in our muscles, we only have enough phosphocreatine stored to provide energy for up to about 10 seconds. So it's not a long time, but it's enough time to give us that ATP. This system is an immediate source of energy. We use it initially in all type of exercises that we're doing, but primarily it helps fuel exercises that are going to be short and very explosive in their movement. So this would be something like jumping, throwing. If you're lifting weights, it's that initial short burst of energy that's needed. Because there's not a lot stored, a lot of athletes, depending on the type of activities that they're participating in, will use creatine supplements. So creatine is just a natural substance. Most of the research done on it shows that it's very safe, but they do kind of caution teenagers from using it just because there's not a lot of research on the long-term safety effects from that age group using creatine. The reason people like to use this are because of the possible benefits. So the three main benefits that are marketed for creatine are that it can help increase your lean muscle mass. It can improve your short-term high-intensity exercises. So I mentioned a lot of weightlifting people will like to use it because it's short-term high-intensity lifts. They want more energy to be able to do a few more reps. If you're sprinting, it gives you that quick initial energy as well. And then another possible benefit is it can help in the recovery time of muscles so that you could actually work out again sooner than if you didn't have enough creatine. So these are the possible benefits. So what does the research show? Does creatine supplements actually help? So this has been researched for several years, and the research does show that if you're doing short periods of high intense activity, that there is a benefit. It actually helps increase the amount of phosphocreatine in the muscles, so it extends that window of exercise out a little bit further. But again, remember, we're only talking up to 10 seconds. The research shows that it's not that beneficial in endurance sports. So again, if you're going to be exercising for several minutes or several hours, really the phosphocreatine system is mainly intended for very short term, up to 10 seconds, maybe 20 seconds. So if you're mostly participating in some of the longer sports, it's probably not going to do you any good to take a creatine supplement. So now we have two systems in place. We have ATP being produced. We have our phosphocreatine system, which is helping regenerate immediate ATP. So if you're going to be doing an activity that is longer than 10 to 20 seconds, you need another way to continue to generate this ATP for the body to use. So if you think about how you're breathing when you're doing a higher intensity activity, you're usually breathing very fast. And the reason for this is because your body is trying to get in more oxygen. So under this condition, if you're breathing very heavily and you're not getting enough oxygen in, the energy system that you're using is called an anaerobic system. So anaerobic means that you're going to be producing energy in an environment where there is not oxygen. So this is typically going to be types of energy that you're doing, activities that you're doing that are going to last anywhere between 30 seconds up to 2 minutes. So again, it's more of these high, short activities. So let's say you're going to be sprinting. Most of us know we can't sprint for an extended period of time, but the short-term energy that's being produced for these activities comes from this anaerobic system. So when we're doing this, we're now going to be drawing from the carbohydrate that's stored in our muscles, which again was referred to as glycogen. So without oxygen, when we break down this stored glycogen, it's not the most efficient system. We're actually only getting about 5% of the total ATP available from stored glycogen because of the metabolic pathway that it follows. But the benefits of this is a really fast way to resupply ATP. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to do activities lasting, again, longer than about 10 to 20 seconds. So when we look at this, we're able to produce only about 2 molecules of ATP for every molecule of glucose under these conditions. So there are some benefits. Again, the benefit is that it's a really fast way to supply this. But one of the negative parts of this is that one of the byproducts when we're breaking this down is lactic acid. So if we look at this diagram here, the molecule on the left, the C6H12O6, is actually a unit of glucose. So you can see there's not oxygen present when we're trying to break this down. Our body's able to produce 2 molecules of ATP, but the byproduct of this is lactic acid. So there's been a lot of research in this area. One of the thoughts is that as lactic acid begins to build up in the muscles, that it may cause the muscles to experience fatigue. Because of this, it prevents us from exercising for an extended period of time under these anaerobic conditions. So those are the kind of 2 drawbacks with this, but it's a short-term energy production when we're doing these types of activities that are really, really high in intensity, where we just can't get enough oxygen into our muscle cells for a different production of energy. So the last system used by the body for energy is called aerobic energy production. And this is a type of energy production that's used if you're doing prolonged lower intensity type of activities. So you can see this would be examples would be walking or jogging or biking. It's a little bit lower. You're able to breathe a little bit more easily. You're not breathing so rapidly. So under these conditions, we're taking, again, that stored glycogen in our muscle cells, and we can more fully break it down to get more ATP. So instead of only getting 5% of the available energy from the stored glucose or glycogen, we're able to get 95%. So because of that, we're able to produce a lot more energy doing these types of activities, which allows us to exercise for a much longer period of time because the energy is being released at a slower rate. So let me go back to this other slide really quickly. So again, the major 3 systems that we looked at were the phosphocreatine, the anaerobic, and then the aerobic system. So these are the 3 main ways that our body is going to burn, specifically carbohydrates that we consume and store for a fuel source in our body. So I mentioned that also fat and protein can be used as energy. So you may be wondering, well, where does fat come into play? How do I start burning stored fat in the body when I'm exercising? So I mentioned in order to use fat as fuel, we're actually breaking down our stored triglycerides into these individual fatty acid units, and these can be converted into a lot of energy. If you're going to burn fat as fuel, it has to be a lower intensity activity because a lot of oxygen is needed. So low to moderate pace activities, so sitting at your desk, for example, or walking at a slower pace, is going to use primarily fat as the fuel source. So to kind of show you this graphic here shows the 3 main types of energy that we can use for fuel. So you can see along the bottom, the red is protein, the darker orange color is carbohydrate, and the lighter is yellow. So what this graph is showing you, if you look across the bottom, is the intensity of the exercise. So on the far left-hand side is going to be lower as we progress along the bottom, and go to the right, it's showing that the intensity of the exercise is increasing. On the left-hand side with the different percentages shows you what percentage of fuel is being used at a certain intensity of exercise. So as an example, let's say you're watching this webinar right now and you're sitting at your desk. You might be wondering, what type of fuel is my body using just to sustain itself while I'm sitting here? So you can see about 5% maybe is coming from protein. So very, very little energy from protein. The darker orange is your carbohydrate use right now. So you can see that's still pretty low. Maybe 35–40% of your energy right now is coming from carbohydrates. So most of the energy while you're at rest is actually coming from fat. So you can see it's about 60%. As we go across the bottom, let's say we're going for a walk, our heart rate's going up, you can see that it's slowly going to switch so that we're using more carbohydrates than fat as the intensity of the exercise changes. So we can use fat as fuel, we just need to make sure that we're exercising or knowing what intensity fat is going to be used as. We have plenty of fat stored in the body. That's why fat is such a great fuel source, because a lot of us store a lot of fat, and it's a very concentrated source of energy. So when we look at fat for fuel, if you're a long distance runner or you're brisk walking for greater than 20 minutes, that's usually when we're going to start to pool fat for fuel. An interesting fact that I read as I was doing some research for the presentation is it said it estimates that the average person has enough fat stored for fuel that they would be able to do over 100 hours of marathon running. So if it's low intensity, we have ample amount of stored energy to do these exercises. So you may be wondering, after I just talked about fat as a fuel source, you may be thinking, well, maybe it's actually better to work out at a lower intensity, so I'm actually burning more energy from fat to help with weight loss. So this is a myth that a lot of people don't quite understand, so I wanted to review this. So if you have a cardio machine at home, excuse me, or if you've ever been on one at the gym, you're going to see a lot of times a chart like I have here on the slide that shows your age, your heart rate, and it breaks down the different zones you're working out. And if you see the yellow one, the bright yellow one, it says the fat burning zone, 60 to 70% of your max heart rate. So sometimes people think, okay, maybe I should stay in this lower intensity range. I'm not working out super hard. My heart rate's still down. And if I do this, I'm actually going to be burning more calories from fat, which probably is going to help me lose more fat if I'm trying to lose weight. The problem and the myth with this is that even though this sounds like a great plan, because you're working out at a lower intensity, overall you're burning fewer calories than if you were working out at a higher intensity, such as in the aerobic or even the anaerobic zone. So when you're looking at burning calories specifically for weight loss, it's not about what zone you're in, but you're looking at overall calories burned. So people would be better off to work out at a higher intensity. They're going to be burning more calories, and then the body can pull the fat stores as needed to help with the deficiencies in overall calories, and that's really where weight loss comes from. So I wanted to explain that because sometimes you'll see this on the weight machines and maybe wonder what that means, or really if it is better to be working out at a lower intensity. So the last one I'm just going to briefly mention is under aerobic. So when you have enough oxygen, your body can use protein as its fuel source, but again, only about 5% of ATP or energy comes from protein. There are times when the percentage is going to be greater than 5%. So the circumstances where this would occur would be if you're not eating enough calories every day, or if you're not getting enough calories specifically from carbohydrates, or enough fuel from carbohydrates even. So if you're working out for a long period of time, if you're doing an endurance exercise, when we begin to use up all of the glycogen that's been stored, our body is then going to start using protein to help fuel that exercise. So this may come if you're running a marathon and you've been out running for 3 or 4 hours, if you're doing a very long swim, or if you're doing a hike that's very long and intense, or if you're doing a long bike ride. Your body can use up to about 10% of the energy now coming from protein. And usually the amino acids, specifically familiar with amino acids at all, are going to be the branched chain amino acids, but I didn't want to get into that in too much detail. So, but protein can change a little bit depending on the duration of the exercise that you are participating in. So this slide just gives you kind of an overview of the aerobic energy production. Again, if the speed of the reaction is slow, meaning it's lower in intensity, there's enough oxygen present, the glucose is going to be broken down into ATP more efficiently. So you can see you get hours of ATP, and then our fatty acids and our amino acids from protein in the presence of oxygen can produce long-term ATP as needed for our various exercises. So if we look at all this information, and now we know the three major types of energy systems in the body, we know that carbohydrates, fat, and protein can come from fuel. It really helps you be better prepared nutritionally to improve your overall fitness. So when you're training or you're exercising, you can now ask yourselves a few questions. So the first question might be, what type of exercise am I doing? Am I doing something that's higher intensity? I'm breathing really heavy under anaerobic conditions, or is it a lower intensity activity and I'm in aerobic conditions? And just by knowing that, you'll know how long you're probably going to be able to sustain that energy, and then to really make sure that you're getting good glycogen stores in the body by consuming good complex carbohydrates in your diet each day. Another good question to ask is, where is my energy coming from? Am I eating enough carbohydrates? Is it mostly coming from fat or protein? And again, this is going to depend on, am I doing anaerobic? Is it aerobic? Then you'll know, is it carbohydrates or fat? If it's really long endurance, you'll know that some of your body stores are probably coming from protein, and that you'll want to replace some of those protein stores when you're done exercising. What energy have I burnt recently? So if you're exercising for a long period of time, you might realize, okay, my glycogen stores are getting low. I've been exercising for a long time. It might be important to slow down or make sure I'm taking some carbohydrates with me while I'm exercising so I don't run out of stored glycogen. If you've ever done a longer event, you know that glycogen stores can become depleted. Some athletes will hit the wall or they'll bonk, and this is because glycogen stores run out in the muscle cells, mostly in the liver, so we don't have the energy needed for both our mental and physical needs, and that leads to fatigue and prevents us from continuing on in the exercise that we're doing. The other thing is how to fuel before, during, and after exercise. So if you're someone that likes to get up and exercise in the morning, it's really important. A lot of people just get up and exercise, don't ever think about fueling their body, but you really want to pick a simple carbohydrate that you can consume before you work out so you're getting the energy that you need. If you don't like to eat in the morning, another thing you can do is to have a snack before you go to bed in the evening. But some good choices in the morning, just something simple that's easy to break down to get some good glucose. Make sure you have good glycogen stores. Maybe have a banana or another fruit that doesn't upset your stomach. You can have a slice of toast. You can also have a small part of a bagel. So there's other things you can have that are really good to help fuel and really are going to aid, especially in the morning. During the day, it's not so necessary because you've been eating throughout the day. But if you're going to be training for longer events, then make sure you're getting the right fuel, mostly to get the glycogen stores you need, or to know how to fuel while you're working out to do that. After you work out, you want to make sure you're getting some good carbohydrates and some protein in your diet, depending on how long you are working out. If you're just working out for 20 or 30 minutes each day, it's going to be easy to replenish that as you eat throughout the day. But if you're training for a longer endurance activity, it would be really helpful to know how to properly fuel for that. So just in summary, as I close today, I just want to review the main things that we talked about. So again, the first one is knowing that carbohydrates, fats, and protein are the main fuel source for the body during exercise and at rest, but that carbohydrates and fats are going to be the primary source, and that very little protein is used for energy. Exercise intensity and duration and your actual overall fitness level is going to determine how your body uses those different fuel sources to convert those into energy. So again, the three main energy systems used by the body are the phosphocreatine system and then the anaerobic and aerobic system. But ultimately what we're doing is taking the fuel we consume and converting that into that high energy ATP so we can give our muscles the energy we need to do the work we want to do. So then I just summarized by talking about how to properly fuel before, during, and exercise so that you can get the most out of your workouts. So thank you for joining me today. If you have any more specific questions about anything I talked about today, please feel free to email me. I've listed my email address here on the screen, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions you have. The last slide lists the resources and the references used for this presentation if you want some more information. If you'd like to download this presentation, in the top right hand corner there is a PDF copy of this, and you're welcome to download this for your reference. So thank you again for joining me today for this webinar.